Well, good morning, everyone. I want to say a special word of greeting to those of you who are watching via ESPN, the Ethereal St. Peter's Network. This morning, we kind of have a heavy agenda, so we'll move along pretty quickly. What I want to do is, before we go on to think about Book 2 of Mere Christianity, I want us to just stop a minute and reflect on Book 1. Remember that the title of Book 1 is Right and Wrong as a Key to the Meaning of the Universe, right? And briefly, the argument there is Lewis is trying to begin with the reality of moral obligation and asking what that reality tells us about the world. Okay, so important thing to remember, when Lewis first gave these radio broadcasts, so far as he knew, it was all ending with Book 1. He didn't know there was going to be a Book 2, a Book 3, and then a Book 4. Okay, so he had to kind of get in everything he really wanted to say in Book 1. And remember where Lewis ends up. We have this reality of a sense of moral obligation, the reality of right and wrong. It can't be explained simply in terms of instinct. It can't simply be explained in terms of convention. It seems to come from beyond us. That is, it might indicate that there is a mind behind the universe. And then, of course, we have to deal with the reality of the fact that we find ourselves actually breaking the law of human nature or the moral law. And what does that tell us about the nature of the universe? And also, what does that tell us about ourselves? So what I want to do this morning is I want to pull out two kind of threads of Book 1 and go back over them in a little bit more detail. So one thread I want us to take just a quick look at, and that is, what is the significance of morality? Why would it be important? And then, second issue, is there a rational basis for believing in God? Is there a rational basis for believing in God? So let's start with the first one. And with the first one, I want to kind of summarize a book Lewis wrote. It's called The Abolition of Man. And I'll explore a couple of things. We obviously don't have time to walk through that whole book, but we'll take a look at some of its major themes. So a number of years ago, Alistair McIntyre, who's a kind of famous philosopher, taught for many years at the University of Notre Dame, published a book called After Virtue, A Study in Moral Theory. And McIntyre comes to an interesting conclusion. McIntyre concludes essentially that all of modern moral philosophy, regardless of its nature or presuppositions, he says finally collapses into what he calls emotivism. Emotivism is the view that morality is not objective, that it's simply a function of the way that we feel. So under emotivism, right, when I say, theft is wrong, what I'm really saying is I don't like theft. When I say it's wrong for someone to take an axe and chop somebody up into pieces, what I'm really saying is I dislike people who chop other people up into pieces with an axe. And while I personally wouldn't do it myself, I can understand how there might be other people who would want to do something like that. And so McIntyre says that's kind of where we are, but he takes a step further than that and he sees this. He says that what's at stake here is not just people doing bad things. He says there's something even more serious at stake. That to the extent that we lose some vision, some more objective moral vision, the ultimate thing that we will lose is an understanding of who we are as human beings. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this book to you is that in some ways, MacIntyre's book, in effect, announces that in writing The Abolition of Man, Lewis was a prophet, because this is exactly what Lewis was arguing when The Abolition of Man was published in 1944. So think about what's going on, right? You've got a number of states. You've got the Nazis in Germany. You've got Stalin in Russia. You've got Franco in Spain, right? All of whom, in effect, reject any sort of objective notion of morality and decide, right, okay, we're in power, we'll decide what's right and what's wrong. And if we decide that hundreds of thousands or even millions of people need to be exterminated, that'll make it right. So Lewis isn't just sort of sitting in an ivory tower somewhere in Oxford, kind of, just thinking lovely thoughts. He's reflecting on the world that we live in. And Lewis says, the real big issue here is that in light of a kind of a totally relativistic morality or a kind of fragmented morality, we'll think of ourselves as being free, which will kind of sound good, right? Who doesn't want to be free? But Lewis says this freedom is actually an awful kind of freedom, because what we'll eventually be freed from is we'll be freed from our humanity. A loss of a sort of in-depth moral vision will result in us basically losing our humanity. So that's the central argument of The Abolition of Man. I'll try and kind of flesh this out a little bit more. So Lewis begins the book by saying that, in effect, right now the idea is that basically all judgments are sort of arbitrary, that all values are sort of subjective, that there are really no genuine emotional responses to things. There's really no sort of standard way of reacting to things. And I think we can see this all the more today, right? We've gotten to the point, and I don't really care who this is or whatever, but we've actually gotten to the point where there are sort of lots of people out there who believe that their own sort of subjective emotional responses to things really shouldn't be measured by anything. Spend some time on Facebook and you'll see lots of evidence to back that up. So Lewis is really concerned about this. Lewis says that traditionally, right, certainly within Christianity, but also in other kind of ways of thinking about morality, the idea has been that morality basically consists of two things. It's not just moral principles, but it's also having the proper emotional responses to things, right? That there are proper emotional responses to various things and various settings, and that to be moral, right, is not only to sort of have a knowledge of moral truth, but also to respond in the proper way to things. Let me give you an example. Let's say that Michael Thompson here is walking down some street in Tallahassee. He happens to glance into a side alley where he sees that two men have knocked an elderly woman to the ground, and they're in the process of taking her purse. Now, as Michael watches that, right, a proper response to that, right, is going to be one of anger, right? Because you're witnessing an injustice, right? You're witnessing somebody who's vulnerable being taken advantage of. You're witnessing an injustice that is something that belongs to somebody is being taken away from them. Therefore, being angry in that situation is a proper response to that situation. And then you've got to sort of think about what you're going to do about that, right? Now, let's say that Michael sees, and I'm not suggesting that Michael would ever do this because he's a really great guy. But let's say that Michael sees this and he sort of sees this happening and he says, oh, okay, and he just walks on. That would not be a proper emotional response to it, right? He might know that robbery's wrong. He might know that it's really a bad thing to knock little old ladies to the ground and take their purse. But the proper emotional response isn't following from that. So Lewis says that both these things need to happen at once. Proper principle, right emotional response. Another way to say this is to say this. Lewis says that Christianity has always taught that what the Christian life really is fundamentally about is what St. Augustine calls ordinate loves. Loving the right things in the right way. And that sin is about inordinate loves, loving the wrong things in the wrong way. Okay, so let me give you an example of that. Once again, I know the example I'm about to give actually I know doesn't affect anybody here at St. Peter's, but it does affect some people. Let's say we have someone who's sort of gotten to the point, right, where they've sort of become fanatical about some particular sports team. I know you probably know people like this, right? None of you are like this, but that's, the devotion has gotten like almost fanatical, right? Almost to the point, right, where their concern and fascination with and attention to this particular team and what it does has almost like become the center of their life. That's an example of an inordinate love, right? There's nothing wrong with loving a sports team or loving a college or loving a church, but we have to remember, right, those are all kind of like finite things. They're not the most important things in the world, right? So from Christianity's standpoint, right, our task as Christians is to begin to sort of reformulate our lives around ordinate loves, with the most important love being, right, the love of God. That's the most important love in the world. And once that love starts to get right, all our other loves begin to find their proper place. So I know this shouldn't come as a shock to us, right? But one of our problems as sinners, right, and this affects all of us, one of our problems as sinners, right, is that it's just the truth, right? There are actually things that we actually do love more than we love God, right? That's the definition of being a sinner. God is not yet the central love of our lives. And that's what it means to be a sinner, okay? So sin here is inordinate love, loving the wrong things in the wrong way. The solution is to love the right things in the right way. That's the way that Lewis approaches this. Now, Lewis refers to the law of human nature, or the moral law. He calls it the Tao, T-A-O. It's a Chinese word that simply means the way. I don't know if he had this in mind, but you may remember that in the book of Acts, Christianity is referred to as the way. I don't know if Lewis made that connection or not, but it's certainly there to make. And Lewis' notion here, right, is this, that if we think of morality as being objective, if we think of morality as something that we sort of need to conform our lives to, rather than we're the ones who are deciding, what's right and wrong all the time, if there is kind of an objectivity to morality, then a number of important things follow. That is, it's possible to have the right emotional responses to things and the right actions in certain situations, right? Where there's an objective standard by which our actions and our emotions are to be judged. Not everything is equally valid or equally good. We have to kind of make judgments about all those things. And this leads us, I think, to a really important point. He says that one of the things that's happened in Western culture is this, that we've kind of fallen into what he calls a kind of a rationalism, which separates reason from emotion, right? Reason and emotion are kind of pulled apart. Lewis says that's actually the wrong thing to do, that actually reason and emotion need to be brought back together again. Reason and emotion actually need to operate together such that, right, one of the things that it means to be a human being is not that you've used your reason to get rid of all your emotions and you've become sort of just a totally rational creature, which would actually make you no longer human. Okay? Okay, then we'd end up with, how are you doing today? I am fine. Lewis says that what has to happen, right, is that reason and emotion need to be integrated such that reason now guides emotion, right? And therefore, right, we're actually able to act in the right way because reason and emotion work together to lead us to sort of do like the right things, okay? That is, you take a course of action, right? And it's not just because you've sort of sat down and sort of worked all this out on paper and now you're doing the right thing. But rather you're doing something because under the guidance of reason and with the sort of the impulse of emotion, right? You're forging ahead in the spirit of, this is right. I've thought this through. My emotions have come alongside, and now I'm moving forward. I'm making a decision, and this is the way to go. That's what Lewis is sort of aiming at here. And he says that this is what education is supposed to do. Now, here's another example of this. Let's think about this idea about there being like proper emotional responses to things that aren't just sort of feelings, but also involve thought as well. Okay, so here's an example. This is something that actually occurred to me. This has probably been like 20 years ago. I was in England and I spent some time in Oxford and wanted to go to Ely, which is near Cambridge, because I wanted to see Ely Cathedral, which in my view is like the most beautiful cathedral in England. So a couple of us went over there, and so we walk in the west doors of the cathedral. We're standing there kind of out in the narthex, and Ely Cathedral probably is about maybe 3 times the length of St. Peter's. So take St. Peter's and put 3 St. Peter's together, and you'll get an idea of the space. So you walk in, and there's just this enormous space that seems to go on like seemingly forever. It's this beautiful sort of Gothic design, and when you walk in, right, you have the proper feeling of reverence and awe, right? Not just because you feel that way, but because, right, you can also think about, right, well, actually, this building was designed as a place of worship. It was designed to be awe-inspiring. It was designed to communicate the holy, and therefore, right, you can think about it, but you can also feel it as well. You have a sense of awesomeness here. Well, as we were standing in our sort of awe moment, a busload of American tourists pulled up. You know how the story's not going to end well right now because the busload of American tourists. So they come in, and the first people in are this man and wife, and they come in, and they're standing almost like right behind us, and the woman here looks around kind of for a few minutes, and then she says to her husband in a rather loud voice, which then echoed throughout the cathedral, "It's just a big church." That was the wrong response to that building, okay? I'm sure that in her own emotional life, right, it was a genuine response for her, but it was wrong. It was objectively wrong to have that sense in that building. That's what Lewis is talking about, okay? So he's trying to integrate thought and feeling here in terms of the moral life. Now, what's at stake in all this? Lewis says, one of our problems is that we kind of think, maybe sort of like in our darker moments, that, morality is basically a matter just of rules and regulations, and, while we all might all be in favor of morality, right, we're not all that thrilled about it, or many people aren't all that thrilled about it. Lewis says, okay, look, we have to think about what's at stake here. What exactly is at stake? And what Lewis says is this. 2 things are at stake here. One of the things at stake is this, that a loss of a sense of a kind of moral order will result in a loss of what it means to truly be a human being. That there are actually proper ways for human beings to think and feel and act. And if we lose a sense of moral order, right, basically we'll sort of end up with a kind of an anarchy. in which everything becomes genuine because everybody thinks that whatever they think is right or true or fitting. Basically because there's no standard. Okay? So that's one thing that Lewis is really concerned about. A second thing that he's concerned about is this. A second thing that he's concerned about is if we get to the point, right, where we don't have a kind of objective moral order by which thoughts and actions can be judged, if it comes down to the fact that all we have is desires or feelings, who or what is to judge the truth or rightness of those desires or feelings? And Lewis says, well, there's an obvious answer to that question. Who's going to sit in judgment of desires and feelings apart from any sort of objective moral order? Those who have power. Those who can enforce their will. They will determine what is right and what is wrong. And Lewis says when we get to that point, and here's the title of the book, we'll arrive at what he says is the abolition of man. In the absence of human nature, in the absence of some sort of objective moral order, right, we will be left with nothing. We'll be left with those in power, in effect enforcing their will on those who don't have it. And basically what we will have lost in the process is our own sense of ourselves as human beings. Now I think Lewis actually turned out to be quite right on that. And I think that, as I said, I think the book in many ways is prophetic. So just one little footnote to that, and then I want to go on. Because I know that I think they're doing something at 11:15 here. I think the issue for us as Christians is this. Lewis doesn't say this, but I'll add this in as a footnote. I think the issue, for us as Christians is this. Living in the culture that we live in, and living, in the kind of the tumult and chaos and all that kind of stuff, it seems that what we really need to be focusing on as Christians, right, is we need to be focused on living out our sense of what it means to be human beings created in the image of God, right? Not created in the image of some political party, or not, in the service of some interesting agenda, or not, following the script of the latest conspiracy theory, or all those things. It seems to me that what we need really to be focused on is what does it mean to live as people who were created in the image of God, and whose final goal in life, the whole reason why we're here, is to come to know and love our Creator. What might it look like to live that out consistently on a day-by-day basis? One thing I can assure you, I don't know how this is going to work out for everybody, but one thing I can assure you is doing that will make you look really weird. And eventually someone's going to ask you a question about why you're so odd. And you'll have an opportunity to tell them, okay, this is why I'm really weird, okay? Okay, let's take a look at the second thing really quickly. And that is the question, is there a rational basis for belief in God? The quick answer to that question is yes. If I don't get any further, I just want to go on record as answering that question, yes. So what I want to do is I want to just briefly summarize a talk that was given by Alistair McGrath. You'll see the footnote at the bottom of page 16. It's from a book he wrote called Mere Apologetics. So Alistair McGrath is English. A little bit about him. He began his career as an atheist. And, at some point in his early teenage years, he became an atheist. He was really interested in the sciences, and he became convinced that science and Christianity were sort of mutually exclusive. And eventually he was admitted to a PhD program in molecular biophysics at Oxford. In the process of getting that degree, he begins reading Lewis's writings and becomes a Christian. And after that, he's involved in a number of research projects, and then decides that what he really wants to do is to study theology. So he goes back to Oxford, gets a PhD in theology. So he's kind of like one of these like real underachievers. He only has 2 PhDs, one in molecular biophysics, one in theology, and kind of a slacker. But he goes on, and McGrath has spent all of his career kind of talking about the relationship between science and Christianity. He actually holds the chair of science and religion at Oxford now. And so I want to just kind of summarize a talk that he gave to graduate students in the sciences at Oxford. And basically what he does is he tells them what he wished someone had told him when he was their age. And that is, actually there is a kind of rational basis for a belief in God. Now, I've listed his points there starting on page 16, so if we don't completely finish, you really have all you need there on page 16 and to 18. Let's take a quick walk through this, and then we'll stop at 11 o'clock. The first thing is this. The first thing is the existence of the universe itself. So McGrath says, you know what, it's really interesting. For a long time, beginning with the ancient world, the understanding was that the universe was eternal. It had always been here. And of course, this gave great aid and comfort to lots of atheists who thought they were scientific, right? The fact the universe has always been here obviously means, right, that the whole notion of creation is just obviously, right, bunk. Because the universe has always been here. Well, of course, then, beginning in the late 50s, early 60s, that begins to change with what's sometimes called Big Bang cosmology. As we actually discover, right, actually the universe hasn't been here forever. It had an origin. There was a time when the universe didn't exist. And McGrath says, that's really interesting in this sense. He says, it doesn't take, a genius to sort of figure this out. So he kind of constructs like an interesting little 3-point argument. Point number 1, right? Nothing comes into existence without a cause, right? We don't walk around expecting things to just magically appear out of nowhere. If something happens, if something comes into being, right, there's probably some sort of cause that's created that. Point number 2, the universe came into existence. Point number 3, therefore, the universe must have some cause. And not just a cause, right, but whatever created the universe actually must be beyond it. Nothing in the universe could have resulted in the creation of the universe. So whatever the cause was, it must be beyond it. And McGrath says, look, this doesn't sort of like prove the existence of God, but what it does say, right, is it suggests there's actually a rational basis for the idea of creation. Creation is not a kind of irrational idea. Another point that McGrath makes is this. This is point number 4 on page 16. The way that he describes it is a universe that's fine-tuned. So let me read to you the bottom there of page 16. This is a quote from McGrath's lecture. He says, nature's fundamental constants turn out to have been fine-tuned to reassuringly life-friendly values. The existence of carbon-based life on Earth depends upon a delicate balance of physical and cosmological forces and parameters. Were any of these qualities slightly altered, balance would have been destroyed and life would not have come into existence. So here's McGrath's point, and he's not alone in making this. McGrath says that the more we know about the universe, the more it seems that almost from the very beginning of the universe has been sort of operating on a kind of code, almost like a genetic code, which in effect, right, has guided and engineered everything about it. And so McGrath says, the idea that the universe is somehow like a random thing, that view is irrational. Many years ago, the astronomer Robert Jastrow gave this kind of analogy. Jastrow was an astrophysicist, and he says, the idea that the universe is a random product is sort of like watching a tornado rip through a junkyard. And then after the tornado passes, there's a fully assembled Boeing 767 sitting there. And then someone says, oh, well, that was just chance. McGrath says, no. Once again, right, this doesn't prove the existence of God, but one of the things it does suggest, right, is that there's kind of like a mind behind the universe that sort of has created this sort of code. That's another point. Another point that McGrath brings up, and this is something that he actually gets from Lewis, is this. This is one of my favorite arguments. McGrath says, one of the things that characterizes human beings is that we have a kind of a deep longing for fulfillment. And the funny thing, right, is that nothing in this world seems to offer us that fulfillment. Okay? The most beautiful scenery, the ideal friendship, the perfect marriage, the perfect element of success, right? None of those things can provide us with ultimate fulfillment. Okay, so one of the things I always tell couples when they're going through the premarital process is I always say, look, don't expect your future spouse to make you totally happy. You're imposing an intolerable burden on another human being who, by the way, is also a sinner like you. So, can marriage make you happy? Yes. Will you find total, complete, and absolute fulfillment in it? No. Okay. McGrath says this. He says, we do have this sense of wanting a fulfillment, but it's a fulfillment that actually is going to come from something that transcends this world. And McGrath says, well, obviously we can come to two conclusions about this, right? We're seeking a happiness that nothing in this world can supply us with. That must mean one of two things. Either A, we're just all deluded, and we just need to sort of give that idea of happiness up and kind of settle for whatever we get in this world. That'd be one way. Or another possibility would be, right, well, actually, we were actually created for a happiness that transcends this world. It's really out there. The fact that we're experiencing it actually is a sort of a sign that the thing really is real. And there really is a real happiness that transcends this world. Of course, we Christians refer to that happiness as God. Right? So that's the argument from desire. One final thing, this is the last one on McGrath's list on page 18, beauty. This is also, I think, really, really nice. Notice here, McGrath is not just using intellectual arguments. And he has a reason for this. Once again, McGrath writes at the beginning of the essay that I'm drawing from. McGrath says, I'm both a scientist and a theologian. And I've been thinking about this stuff for my whole adult life. And he says, the reason why I'm a Christian is because, for me, Christianity helps me to make the most sense of the world, more sense than anything else. And McGrath says, that's why I'm a Christian, because it actually makes sense of the world that I live in. So one final thing, and then we'll stop. This is the argument from beauty. So think about the following scenario, okay? You're sitting, in some wonderful place, maybe in a concert hall or something like that, listening to your favorite piece of music, right? Let's just take, for an example, Beethoven's 6th Symphony, the Pastoral Symphony. And you find yourself just enraptured by it, right? It's not just you're listening, but you've sort of become absorbed in the music. So a little reminder here, don't do this while driving, okay? Because that could result in some bad things. So anyway, okay, you're listening to the music, and you sort of become absorbed almost to the point, right, where you sort of like lose track of time. You're really not aware anymore that this has gone on for 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes. You're absorbed. McGrath asks, okay, now what's happening? Why is it that you're totally absorbed? And once again, McGrath says, there are two possible answers. Answer number one could be a sort of neurological explanation, right? And that would be, right, that the notes of this music simply strike you the right way. It's totally a physical, neurological phenomena, and that's why you find this music attractive. It's because it's sort of like a physical pleasure. And that's it. That's all that's going on. Certainly, right, we know that Ludwig van Beethoven would not agree with that view. Okay, this is great. But McGrath says there's another possibility. What if the beauty of that music, and here we could include the beauty of a particular scene, the beauty of some particular artwork, whatever, right? The beauty of a liturgy, right? What if that attracts us? Because it's a form of beauty, lowercase b, that's a manifestation of beauty, capital B. What if each experience of beauty is sort of like a window opening up in the world that's letting us have access to beauty, capital B? So with that, I want to conclude with just a brief reading from Lewis's sermon called The Weight of Glory. If you have never read anything by Lewis and don't have a lot of time on your hands, I would suggest reading this one sermon. It's a sermon that was preached during the Second World War. It's called The Weight of Glory. Here's what he says. We do not want merely to see beauty, though God knows, even though it's bounty enough. We want something else which can hardly be put into words. To be united with the beauty we see, to pass into it, to receive it into ourselves, to bathe in it, to become part of it. At this present, we are on the outside of the world, the wrong side of the door. We discern the freshness and purity of morning, but they do not make us fresh and pure. We cannot mingle with the splendors we see, but all the leaves of the New Testament are wrestling with the rumor that it will not always be so. Someday, God willing, we shall get in. When human souls have become as perfect in voluntary obedience as the inanimate creation is in its lifeless obedience, then they will put on its glory, or rather, that greater glory of which nature is the first sketch. That is, what Lewis is saying here is that all our experiences of beauty are in effect a kind of an intimation of the beauty of God. All our experiences of beauty are sort of suggestions, intimations, or echoes of beauty at its source, and therefore, Lewis says, think about it this way. Think about the most beautiful thing you have ever looked at. Your spouse, your first child, the Grand Canyon, whatever. Think about the most beautiful thing you have ever looked at, and then remember that that thing is simply only a faint echo and preparation for the beauty of God. And therefore, beauty is one of the ways that God is sort of like pulling us towards him, right? Because he's the source of all beauty. Okay, so what I've tried to suggest here is that there actually is a rational basis for believing in God if we kind of look at these things and begin putting them together. If there is a God behind the world as we know it, everything I've just suggested is something that we would expect to be true. And lo and behold, of course, it is. Okay. Next week, Father Bill is going to take us into book 2, in which Lewis is going to start talking about Christian beliefs. So I think he's going to try and do chapters 1 through 3 of book 2. We might not get quite that far, but if you want to read ahead, read chapters 1 through 3 of book 2. And with that, we'll have to stop.